Good morning. I put the show on yesterday, as I always do on Monday, but unfortunately, I wasn't able to get it online. I don't know whether that had to do with the big problem that they were having with uh, Facebook and some of the other media. Uh, but whatever the case, you can plan as much as you want. But as I mentioned in an earlier program, man plans, God laughs. So now I'm doing the program again. A couple of things I wanted to talk about. Uh, my mystery that you've been listening to, Lightning at 200 Durham Street, is set in 1928. I've said a few things about 1928, and I want to say a few more things because it impacts the story. And what was it like back in 1928? Well, things were quite different. Monetarily, things were very different. I'll show you what I mean as soon as I find the right. There it is. 1928. Look at what you could buy a house for. That was relatively inexpensive, especially compared to today. I don't know what you multiply it by, but it'd be a big number. Would it be 100 or would it be 1,000? $7,800 would buy you a new house. That's a good house back in 1928. Of course, the average income was only $2,500. Not so good compared to today, but if you compare that 2,500 that the person was making to the 7,800 that the house cost, that was a third. If you're buying a house today, are you making a third of what the house costs? Probably not. So obviously house prices have inflated quite a bit. New car, $500. Average rent, hallelujah, $20 a month. Unbelievable, isn't it, that you could rent a place for $20 a month. The other thing I wanted to mention was highways. You know, the roads in 1928 were better than they had been a couple of years earlier, but they still weren't that great. As a matter of fact, in 1926, the Ontario government proudly proclaimed that by the end of that year, they would have a highway, a paved highway, not just a highway. There were lots of highways, but they were gravel. They'd have a paved highway that ran all the way from Windsor to the Quebec border. Can you believe that? Highway 2. What a wonderful highway to have. So there you go in 1928 if you wanted to go cruising down the highway. Unless you're on Highway 2, there's a good chance you'd be on gravel road. Well, of course, things have changed tremendously since then. We have the 400 series of highways, and boy, what a difference. So many roads, even in the country, are now paved one way or another. So 1928, different universe altogether. And that's where this story is set. Now, I'm going to go to the story, and we know what's happened so far in this story. We have had our hero, who continues to be the hero or main character in the next 30 some odd books I've written. And he's young at the start of this book, and he's hit by lightning. And that happens, and then all of a sudden we jump back in time to an assignment that he had received in school, and that assignment leads him him and his friends into the bush, and in the bush he and his best friend J.D. discover a body. Of course, the body was then taken into town, and the coroner, Dr. Whittles, wants to examine the body. Now, he can't cut it up yet because he hasn't been able to contact the next of kin. As a matter of fact, they don't even know who the body is. And that's where we pick up the story today. If you'll recall, Chief Petrovic had asked the mayor for help, and help was coming. So I'll read you some of today's story. There was a rap on Chief Petrovic's office door shortly after 1:30 on Thursday afternoon. "What?" said the chief. He was busy doing paperwork, which he just just like terribly. The secretary, Sherry Simpson, peeked through the partially open door and said, "There's a Detective Gerald O'Neill from London here to see you, sir." "Send him in," said Petrovic. The two men exchanged hellos, and Petrovic spent the next few minutes telling this detective, O'Neill, what he knew about the case. "In a nutshell," he said, "we haven't been able to identify the body, we found no clues, and we don't know the motive." The London detective smiled and said, "That's great. It's better that way, when you know nothing to begin with, because then you're not likely to follow the wrong path." It sounds like O'Neill has a positive attitude. Chief Petrovic and O'Neill left Chaseford and went to the cabin to take a look around that afternoon. And once they were out there, O'Neill Petrovic told O'Neill that according to the coroner's initial report, the woman was in her early 50s. And he said, by the way, he said, "I've got one of my constables over at the office, the county office, trying to find the ownership of the land, so we'll know who at least owns the land. That might help us." So they made it to the cabin. And once they got to the cabin, they had Constable Smith with them. The detective O'Neill said to Jake Smith, "Take me on a tour. Let's start with the cabin, then we'll take a look at that cooking site that I saw in the report. Then I want to see the area where the horses were tied up. Then I hear there's a trail that leads away from the cabin in the other direction. I want to go down that trail too." And he says, "By that time, we'll be ready for supper." So it sounds like a long afternoon ahead. So O'Neill then turned to the chief and said, "When Jake and I head down that unexplored trail, would you be kind enough to drive around to the next concession, because I'm pretty sure that's where it goes, and wait for us?" "I can do that," the chief responded. So they go on about their business. The chief goes back, gets in the car, and probably has a coffee at the farmhouse, as he knows it'll be a long time. Or maybe he went back to town, went to Mabel's diner. Once we're in the cabin, O'Neill asked about the head wound that the victim had received. He said, according to the coroner, it does not look like she was struck with a heavy blunt object. It looks more like she hit her head as she fell. The coroner doesn't even think the damage is a result of her hitting the floor. So they stood there for a moment, and then O'Neill said, looking at the chalk outline where the body was, and where the furniture currently was located, "I don't see what she could have hit her head on. Let's see if something was moved while you were examining the body originally." They got down on their hands and knees, and close scrutiny revealed that a small cupboard had been moved. Jake and the chief moved the cupboard back to its original position. When they moved the cupboard, it revealed a small stain on the floor. When they got close to the stain, they noticed there was no odor. The area was dry. Further examination of the cabin revealed no additional clues. So they were left thinking that likely she'd hit her head on the side of that cupboard on her way to the floor. So was she conscious or unconscious at that time? I don't know. And I'm the writer. I should know. Anyway, they left the cabin and they went out and went to where the cooking site was. They scouted around there, really didn't find anything of interest. Then they went to where the horses had been tied up, and they noticed that, there's more than one horse had been tied here, because if you look closely, there are two different sets of hoof prints. Either one horse was smaller than the other, or a totally different breed. Okay, I told them a little bit, but not a lot. At least they got the idea of two horses. So then O'Neill got to his feet and said, "Okay, Jake, let's go down that trail. Hopefully the chief's at the other end of it." He said, "Now when we go down the trail, I'm going to examine the first 4 or 5 feet to the side, one side, and you'll examine the 4 or 5 feet to the other side of the trail." So they started down it, and they, looked in the grass and moved stuff with their feet and so on, and didn't find anything for 10 or 15 minutes. And then Jake says, "Detective, over here, I think I found something." And they looked at it. "Looks like a tin cup," said Jake. "Don't touch it," said O'Neill. "If we're lucky, we'll get some fingerprints." So the two of them then got down and started to thoroughly search the nearby area. They were pleased with the results. They found another cup, and they found an empty whiskey bottle. They carefully put their prizes in Jake's knapsack. The journey down the rest of the trail was uneventful, and the good news is that when they arrived at the end of the trail, Chief Petrovic was sitting there waiting for them. "Well, boys," he said, "either I'm really fast, or it took you a bit longer than I thought it would. Anyway, by the time we get to town, it'll be 6 o'clock. I'm hungry, and I want to go to Mabel's Diner and get today's special." So that afternoon, and one afternoon, that detective from London had helped quite a bit. They'd found some clues, and up until that point in time, they didn't have much. Then the next day was now Friday. There were some things that went on as well. Later that day after lunch, this is the next day on Friday, Constable Peter Herman, who was the constable that Chief Petrovic had over at the registry office, was excited. He said, "I've got some news for you, Chief. Don't get too excited, though. But one of the registry clerks has been a big help. She's been searching the title of the land that the bush is on. It hasn't been easy, but we finally found it. We've got the owner's name." Well, Chief Petrovic was quite interested at this. He said, "Okay, what's the name, Constable?" And Herman said, "The name is Bushland Farm." Well, thanks a lot, Constable Herman," said Petrovic. "I'll need more help than that. Get back to work and call me when you have some real information." "The chief sounds kind of grumpy," said the registry clerk. Constable Herman, who was a shade pinker than he had been before the call, agreed. The clerk said, "Constable Herman, I think you should now head over to the municipal office. They have the tax bills over there. And if you get a name from the tax bill, at least you'll have if you can't get a name, at least you'll have an address where the tax bill is sent. That could be helpful. Remember, Bushland Farms could be a group of owners or a family that decided with the advice of their accountant to use the name for business purposes. It does seem very mysterious, though. Anyway, keep in mind, it's a very big chunk of land. If you include the 200 acres across from the bush, you got a total of 4,000 acres there. 4,000 acres. It was the distance between a couple of concessions, because the one concession road stopped when it got to the bush. It's a big bush. So Constable Herman, with those ideas in his mind, headed over to the municipal office. And he spoke to the clerk in charge of tax notices and tax collections. He knew the clerk. "Well, Stan," he said, "you've done this job for a number of years. I remember coming here with my parents when they came in to pay their taxes." "Yes, Peter, your parents were always good customers. They paid and paid on time." "But I've got a tricky one for you today, Stan," said Peter. I've just come from the registry office and I'm trying to track down the owner of some bushland out near Goshawk. The land's in the name of a registered company called Bushland Farm. That doesn't help us. We're investigating a crime and we need a person's name. Now I know you'll have the address where you send the tax bill, but I wondered if over the years you met someone who may have come in and paid the bill. Or also, since you seem to know everyone in the area, maybe you know the family connected to Bushland Farm. Stan looked at him and said, "It's been a long time, Peter, since I've seen anybody with a connection to Bushland Farm. I do recognize the name, and a few years ago, up until a few years ago, Hugh Carter would come in and pay the tax bill for the property." "I've never heard of that name before," said Peter. Stan smiled at him. "Young people. That's likely because he was before your time, Peter. He was a very important man in this area. He was a person most of us liked and respected. We even voted him to become a member of Parliament." "Oh, yeah," Peter said. "That Hugh Carter, yeah. There's a picture of him in the municipal building not far from the police chief's office. Yeah, I know the guy now. Do you know where he lives?" Stan looked at him again and said, "I think he probably went to heaven. He's been dead at least 15 years. The entire family many years ago moved to Ottawa. I believe his wife Ruth is still alive. He had two sons, Proctor and Amos, and a daughter, Louise. According to my wife's memory, the daughter lives with her mother in Ottawa." Now Constable Herman felt much better. He was looking forward to visiting Chief Petrovic. He was pleased with what he'd found out. He finally had some information that was useful. He met the chief a little later and he told him the information, and the chief actually smiled. He smiled and he said, "Good work, Peter. You're going to keep your job anyway." Peter assumed the chief was kidding. At least he hoped he was. Petrovic said, "Now I'll have to get a hold of the Ottawa police and have them contact Ruth Carter so she knows something happened on her land." So he does that. And when he does contact Ottawa, he contacts or gets in touch with a man called Rutherford, Assistant Chief Rutherford of the Ottawa Police. He tells him that they found a body on the land that Ruth Carter and her family owned. And he said it was a week ago, but there had been some difficulties, and that's why he had trouble getting to him. Almost a week, Monday, Friday. He said that they needed to identify the body, and he was hoping that maybe member of the family could come to Chaseford to do that in case it was a relative. And Rutherford said, he said, the Carters, he says, they're quite a family. He said, "I remember, Mr. Carter, he was a great public servant. I met him a couple of times. He wasn't the least bit arrogant. He was always trying to do his best for the people. Ottawa lost a good man when he died, but yes, his wife is still alive, and I think I know where she lives." So he said, "I'll see what I can do." Well, it turned out that Ruth Carter wasn't well. She still had her faculties, but she wasn't well enough to travel. So that meant that Chief Petrovic was going to have to go to Ottawa. That's as far as we're taking the story today. There's one other thing I want to mention, and it has to do with writing, or thinking, or perhaps both. And I've been accused of being a ripple thinker. And I don't think I'm that much different than other people. But what I mean by that is I'll think of one idea and it'll lead me to another idea. Now here's something you can try. You can try it. It's more fun if you try it with someone else. You try it with some friends or with your family. You sit down and someone says something. Well, let's write a short story, or make up a short story, and you say anything. Okay. I was walking down the street. The next person says something else. And you were hit by a car and run over. There you go. Short story, nice and neat, packaged up. Maybe not. Because the next person, or maybe you, say, thank God I wasn't severely injured. I was able to crawl across the street and up to the door of a house. And you stop, and the person says, the lights were out and the door opened very slowly. Now it's your turn. And to my amazement, there was a dog wearing a wig standing in the door. Back to the other person. You've given them a tough one. Then I realized it wasn't a dog, but it was my ancient grandmother. She had a kimono on. And then it's back to the other person. This could go on, forever almost. But you better wrap it up at some point in time. But one thought produces another thought produces another thought. Hopefully you'll tie those together. I find when I'm writing sometimes, occasionally, yesterday I had to go back and insert some information so I could patch up the rest of my story. Anyway, I hope you're having a great day, and that's all I have to say, except I'm going to put this on the screen in case you want to contact me. You see the email is at the bottom there, and that's where to reach me. And that's it. So have a great day.